Do you know how a miniature train led to the reinvention of family entertainment? Do you know why Disneyland ended up in a rural community called Anaheim? Answers to these questions and more in this episode of Once Upon a Train.
I have always loved trains. Walt Disney wrote those words in an article for Railroad magazine in 1965. He recounts how railroading played a continuing role throughout his life. It started with the exciting stories about working for railroads told by his father, Elias, and Uncle Mike Martin. Actually, his father's cousin, Uncle Mike, was an engineer for the Santa Fe Railroad. His route often took him through Walt's boyhood home of Marceline, Missouri. Uncle Mike would sound a special whistle signal when he'd see Walt and his brothers waving at his train. As a teen, Walt followed his brother Roy's advice and became a news butcher. Walt worked for the Van Noy Corporation that held concessionaire agreements with several railroads. Based at Kansas City's Union Station, Walt would walk through the commuter cars selling candy, fruit, newspapers, cigarettes, and so on. We take a closer look at his news butch adventures in another episode. The pivotal moment from this experience was the engine crew showing Walt how to operate a steam locomotive. Much later, his love of trains was rekindled by learning of miniature-life steam railroads and, in Ward Kimball's backyard, full-size narrow-gauge trains. We discussed the creation of Walt's Carrollwood Pacific Railroad in other episodes. Key to this story is what the Carrollwood Pacific would help inspire Walt to create. Initially, he thought to use his miniature train to offer visitors tours around the studios. Logistics and the fact that sound stages aren't exciting when nothing is being filmed there led to an idea for a little park that would come to be known as Disneyland. Located across Riverside Drive from the studio, it would include a carousel, gravity boat ride, and a 1/8 scale railroad, so he could run the Lily Bell there. As the idea grew, the concept was plussed with an Old West town, a Mississippi steamboat circling an island, and a narrow gauge train. To paraphrase J.R.R. Tolkien, Disneyland became a tale that grew in the telling. Walt drew inspiration from Tivoli Gardens, Henry Ford's Greenfield Village, Knott's Berry Farm, and amusement parks as his concept for a theme park developed. It became clear that Burbank had no site large enough to hold all these ideas. Walt hired Stanford research associates to identify a suitable setting for his magical little park. They found that Anaheim, at that time a rural agricultural community, met all of his requirements. Walt's first description of Disneyland was, "I want it to look like nothing else in the world, and it should be surrounded by a train." Several Disneyland studies were created by some of the first Imagineers: Bruce Bushman, Marvin Davis, and Bill Martin. None of the drawings they created seemed to fully convey the scope, excitement, and beauty of the park. Over a marathon weekend, Walt described his vision for Disneyland to Herb Ryman, a fine artist, who then transformed words into art. This collaboration rendered a bird's-eye view of the park that would hopefully convince bankers to finance Walt's dream. Of particular note within this masterpiece, the legend states, approximately 45 acres within railroad tracks. Lilliputian land features the Lily Bell and Carrollwood Pacific train. There's a roundhouse and turntable that guests can visit inside the park. And the Disneyland Railroad trains are shown running counterclockwise, opposite the way they actually do. Although this concept image helped secure funding, the project ran out of money several times. Walt sold his vacation home and borrowed against his life insurance to help pay for it. This resulted in him personally owning the Disneyland Railroad. Harrison Buzz Price of Stanford Research Associates recommended constructing 3 trains to serve the anticipated attendance. Walt could only afford to build 2 for the park opening in 1955, with the thought that more could be added later. With input from Ward Kimball, Jerry Best, Roger Broggie, and others, Walt decided that the 2 trains would represent different eras and have unique themes. There would be a fancy passenger train from the 1890s and a rustic freight train of the 1870s. Naturally, each train would be pulled by an appropriate locomotive. After looking at trains of various scales, Walt settled on the narrow gauge equipment that he saw at Traveltown in Los Angeles. These engines and rail cars are nominally 5/8 the size of standard gauge trains. It's sometimes assumed that the 1870s engine, number 1 of the Disneyland Railroad, is just a bigger version of Walt's 1/8 scale Lilybell locomotive. Although they share many design elements in common, number 1's proportions and operations are quite different from the Lilybell. For example, the cab is 3/4 size, although the rest of the locomotive is 5/8 the size of Central Pacific 173, upon which the Lilybell was based. Roger Broggie suggested this increase, possibly because of the challenge of finding 5/8 scale humans to fit inside the cab. Both engines 1 and 2 are mechanically identical. Great care was taken to make them distinct and appear to be from different decades. Engine number 2 was fashioned after a Rogers locomotive built in 1887 for the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. Intended for passenger service, those historic locomotives had more brass trim and ornate decorations than steam engines intended for freight use. Walt invited several major rail carriers of the 1950s to sponsor the Disneyland Railroad. Santa Fe accepted this honor. This was particularly fitting because of the Disney family's historic connections to it. As we discussed in another episode, naming locomotives after notable people was a 19th century custom. Engine number 1 was named the C.K. Holliday after the first president of the Santa Fe Railroad, Cyrus Kurtz Holliday. Engine number 2 received the name E.P. Ripley. Edward Payson Ripley served as president of the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad from 1895 until 1920. Interestingly, E.P. Ripley was not the original name for number 2. It was to be named after William Barstow Strong. Mr. Strong was president of the ATSF from 1881 to 1889, squarely in the time the locomotive number 2 is meant to represent. It's not clear why his name was replaced with E.P. Ripley. The city of Barstow, California, is named after him, so perhaps it was felt he had been honored enough. Many of the locomotive's parts were fabricated at the Walt Disney Studios. For the huge components, Roger had Dixon Boiler Works craft the boilers, and Wilmington Iron Works build the wheels and frames. The boilers, frames, and wheels were joined together in Wilmington, California, and trucked to Anaheim for final assembly and finishing. Meanwhile, back at the studio, construction of the rail cars commenced. The freight consist was fashioned after authentic cattle cars and gondolas of the 1870s, and was completed with a caboose. A consist is the collection of rail cars that comprise a train. Wooden passenger cars of the 1890s served as inspiration for the passenger train. That consist included a combine, which is the subject of another episode, 4 typical passenger coaches, and an observation coach that has an open-air deck at the rear of the car. The passenger train would become known as Retlaw 1 among cast members, with Retlaw 2 being the nickname of the freight train. As you may recall, Retlaw is Walter spelled backwards. The rail cars were loaded onto trucks and driven from Burbank to Anaheim. This must have created quite a sight for the people out on the streets that day. The planning and construction of the track at the park was supervised by the newly hired Earl Vilmer. Earl would later play a major role in the making of the Walt Disney World Railroad. He was also put in charge of operations of the newly named Santa Fe and Disneyland Railroad. As we detail in the Walt Disney World Railroad episode, the original concept for the Disneyland Main Street station was much larger and grander than what was actually built. Imagineers Bill Martin and Ed Held, likely with input from Ward Kimball, designed a smaller yet stately Victorian structure. This building is not based upon any specific train station, but represents various aesthetics of the late 1800s. They used forced perspective on the station's second and third floors to create the illusion of greater height. The original larger station concept wasn't abandoned, though. It was built at the Magic Kingdom and has greeted countless guests since 1971. The locomotives were the park's first operating attraction. Even though the railway itself wasn't complete, the E.P. Ripley first steamed up on June 18, 1955, with Walt Disney at the throttle. It was the same locomotive that Walt operated during the opening day celebration and broadcast, joined by California Governor Godwin Knight and Santa Fe President Fred Gurley. At an Independence Day preview party for studio employees and their families, Ward Kimball was the engineer on the CK Holiday, and Walt once again operated the Ripley. This image of the two rail fans is reminiscent of a portrait of them taken at Henry Ford's Greenfield Village, including Walt's Napoleonic hand and shirt pose. The Santa Fe and Disneyland Railway had just 2 stations when it opened, Main Street Station, of course, and a Frontierland station. The backstory of that building is part of an episode dedicated to Ward Kimball. Of importance to this story is that Walt had to construct a depot when Ward wouldn't give back his Grizzly Flats station. The Frontierland station is essentially a duplicate of Ward's depot, with the major changes being additional doors to allow passengers onto the waiting platform and bay windows on both the front and back. Efforts to make the train operations period authentic were well-intentioned, but proved problematic. Firstly, was a concept that each train would only stop at its station, the elegant passenger train at Main Street Station, and the rustic freight consist at Frontierland. This approach required sidings next to each station so that the moving train could pass the stopped one as its passengers departed and others boarded. A brakeman would close the switch to the siding as the passing train approached. They would then open that switch after that train had cleared the station. Shortly after the park opened, a too eager brakeman closed the switch before the passenger train fully arrived at Main Street Station. The Grand Canyon observation car twisted sideways as its front wheels were on the track closest to the station and the rear wheels were on the passing track. The car then struck a concrete embankment and derailed. Fortunately, no one was injured. Legend has it that the responsible, or perhaps irresponsible, brakeman used the excitement following the accident to clean out his locker and leave, never to be seen again. Secondly, with each train only stopping at its corresponding station, the Grand Circle Tour was exactly that, a loop where you could only get off where you got on. There were no stations in Fantasyland or Tomorrowland yet, so the trains were more of a tour bus than a form of transportation. The complex passing process was abandoned after a while, so that both trains stopped at both stations and later, additional stations. Finally, riding the freight car was not a great experience. Cattle cars worked fine for cattle, not so much for human guests. The same was true for the gondolas that had very few seats and were open to the sometimes brutal Southern California sun. The freight car's authenticity was at Walt's specific direction. He wanted people to know how it feels to be a cow or a sheep riding in those cars. City Hall soon heard complaints from guests who said the ride made them feel like cows and sheep. After a few weeks, the cattle cars had some slats removed to at least provide better views. Eventually, the freight train cars were redesigned to provide more seating and awnings. As Buzz Price predicted, ridership demand greatly exceeded the capacity of the two trains. This resulted in long lines to board, creating unhappy guests. The addition of more trains and stations is covered in Part 2 of this story. There have been a few special events involving Engines 1 and 2. In March 1999, Disneyland held a rededication for the EP Ripley. Cynthia Harris, then president of the Disneyland Resort, Michael Broggie, son of Disney legend Roger Broggie, other Disneyland cast members, and E.P. Ripley III, grandson of the engine's namesake, celebrated the restoration of Number 2. They were joined at Main Street Station by Mickey Mouse and Goofy, who arrived on the Kalamazoo handcar. 2005 was not just the 50th anniversary of Disneyland, but also the Disneyland Railroad. Michael Broggie challenged me to think of a way to properly celebrate that milestone. It had always bothered me that Engines 1 and 2 lacked builder's plates. These identify the builder, when and where the locomotive was built, the serial number, and so on. So much attention to detail had been applied to both engines that it seemed that plates honoring their creation were conspicuous by their absence. I proposed to Disneyland leadership that we could make suitable plates for the Holiday and Ripley. Park management thought this was a great idea and asked Imagineering Principal Creative Director Ray Spencer to collaborate with me on it. Ray would become one of my best friends, and you'll hear more about him in other episodes. Together, Ray and I worked with some notable historians, including Steve DeGaetano, author of Welcome Aboard the Disneyland Railroad, to create designs that would be true to the heritage of each locomotive. The Holiday is based on Central Pacific's 173 that had large, ornate scrollwork as the builder's plates. These were located between the drive wheels on the CP-173 and other engines. The Disneyland Roundhouse operations crew were concerned that this placement might interfere with the maintenance of the engine's brakes. Indeed, this is why other builders opted to put their plates elsewhere. So instead, we chose to fashion this plate on the classic Baldwin Locomotive Works round design from the 1870s. As mentioned, the Ripley is a close replica of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad locomotives that were built by the Rogers Locomotive and Machine Works in 1887. We emulated their overall design, but used the layout of the Schenectady Locomotive Works plates, as this gave us more room for verbiage. I wanted to include some subtle tributes to the people who made these engines. As you know, Walt personally paid for their construction. This was through his private company, WED Enterprises. I honored that history by creating the fictional WED Locomotive Works, WED standing, of course, for Walter Elias Disney. The Disneyland Railroad was later owned by Retlaw Enterprises, the successor to WED, so I put a Retlaw reference on plate number 1. The trains would not have been possible without Roger Broggie's leadership and can-do attitude. So on the Ripley's plate, I gave him the title of General Manager. Walt, of course, was President, and this position tied back to his role with the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad. Use of the Retlaw name required approval from Walt's daughter, Diane Disney Miller. Also, even though Retlaw Enterprises no longer owned the trains, I wanted to get feedback about the project from Diane. I was intending to modify something that Walt had personally created, and I felt his family should be able to provide some input. Diane loved the idea and wanted to do something nice for the cast members who work on the Disneyland Railroad. I suggested to her that we could make miniature pins of the builder's plates and present these to the railroad cast. She liked this idea too, and not only paid for the pins, she wrote a nice note of appreciation to those cast members. Right around the time of the 50th anniversary, I arranged to bring the pins to the park and spent that day inside the cast break room at the New Orleans Square station. As each crew would rotate in for their breaks, I presented them with a set of pins along with Diane's best wishes. Some cast members were literally moved to tears by this simple gesture. They shared stories of special moments working on the trains and how much they are personally honored to continue Walt's legacy. The builder's plates themselves were created by Horty Van Innovations. If that name sounds a bit familiar to you, it's because Horty Van supplied all of the flags and bunting for the park since 1955. They even made the dedication plaque that adorns the base of the town square flagpole. The owners of Horty Van, Harry Vanderwyck and his brother, would sometimes have breakfast with Walt and discuss ways to decorate new attractions. There was simply no company more appropriate to make these builder's plates.
These are the builder's plates I created for the Disneyland Railroad's 50th anniversary in 2005. We made duplicates of them at the same time and from the same mold as those that appear on the locomotives today. Cast members were able to acquire sets of these, and in all the time since then, I have never seen a set available for sale anywhere. That suggests that people who were able to buy these truly appreciate what they represent and the heritage of the Disneyland Railroad. You can see a set of these at Walt Disney's Carrollwood Barn in Griffith Park. This is not the only set of Disney builder plates that ever existed. This is a builder's plate from the Fort Wilderness Railroad locomotives. It reads, "The Mapo Locomotive Works, Walt Disney Productions, California, USA, 1973. How I came to have this and what we're going to do with it is the subject for another episode.
The Fullerton Train Museum formerly held an annual Fullerton Railroad Days event to educate the public about the importance of trains to Southern California, sometimes drawing more than 40,000 visitors over 2 days. The fair featured visiting locomotives and historic rail cars. Disneyland supported the event several times by displaying the E.P. Ripley, C.K. Holiday, and other Disneyland Railroad equipment over the years. These displays enabled guests to walk through the engine cabs and sometimes ring the bell and blow the whistle. The Ripley's original boiler was also put on display, opened up so that people could see how a steam locomotive actually works. Regarding collectibles, specifically related to engines 1 and 2, there have been just a few in the 69 years since their debut. Perhaps the earliest of these is a children's menu from the Disneyland Hotel. It showed the C.K. Holiday along with some of the Retlaw 2 cars. The train could be punched out of the menu, folded up, and then mailed like a postcard. Curiously, this menu wasn't designed by Disney. It was created by the Darcy Advertising Company for the Disneyland Hotel. The menus, especially one where the train has not been punched out, command high prices when they rarely appear at auction. Original artworks featuring the Holiday and Ripley were crafted for the Trains of Disney show that I helped curate in 2011. It was at this Disney Gallery event that Lowell Smith's N-scale model of the CK Holiday premiered. Fun fact, it is one of these models that appears on the Disneyland of Walt's Imagination exhibit at the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. Also offered were a few Retlaw 2 cars in their opening day appearance. Cows and sheep were not included. Over the years, miniaturist Robert Oshevsky created amazing scale models of every structure along Main Street, USA. These could be assembled into a magnificent layout, from Main Street Station to Sleeping Beauty's castle. We had Bachmann make this N-scale set of the Ripley and some of the Retlaw 1 cars. Officially for Disneyland's 50th anniversary, this product was also intended to provide the train that would circle the Oshevsky models and was designed with his expert input. Because of the overwhelming success of the G-Gauge Lilybell models, I asked both Heartland Locomotive Works and AccuCraft Trains to prepare samples of a G-Gauge CK Holiday. Sadly, I didn't move forward with the Heartland Holiday because of its similarity to the Lilybell. Instead, I opted for the Ernest S. Marsh engine as their next release. Disneyland was impressed with AccuCraft's fine brass and stainless steel version of the Holiday, but were concerned that the retail price of this museum-quality product would be too high for most guests. In support of the Carolwood Foundation, Heartland made a single G-Gauge model of the EP Ripley, and this is on display at Walt Disney's Carolwood Barn in Griffith Park.
This model I made. It's of the Santa Fe and Disneyland Grand Canyon observation coach, which would later become the Lilybell presidential coach. I made this to accompany the Santa Fe and Disneyland Wells Fargo Express Combine so that we could run this full consist as part of the Walt's Trains exhibition at the Walt Disney Family Museum in 2014 and 2015. These are the very same pins that I gave out to the Railroad cast members back in 2005 for the Railroad's 50th anniversary. Diane paid for these and wrote a lovely note. It says, "My dad's love of trains is well known and is shared by millions of people around the world. The trains of Disneyland have brought delight and a sense of wonderful adventure to all who have visited this happy place. We so respect and admire all whose skill and dedication have kept these giants running and looking so gorgeous. And the engineer is still every child's hero. Diane Disney Miller." Interestingly, because of the scale of the park, the locomotives do look big, but they're really not that big. They're essentially 5/8 the size of real steam locomotives of the late 1800s. A few years ago, Lego created a Disney train consist. This is the CK Holiday. It's clearly labeled as such. It says Disneyland Railroad, has one of the converted gondolas from Retlaw 2, and the Lilybell coach that now appears on the Disneyland Railroad. This is a model that accompanied it of Main Street Station, although it just says Disney Station instead of Disneyland Station. It's still a very nice model. I've enhanced this one with a lighting kit that I was able to acquire online. A few years ago, the Hachette Model Company of Japan produced what they called a magazine of the CK Holiday. They came out each week, and it would include a part or several pieces of the model that you would then build. It's remarkably accurate. They really did the research on this one. These occasionally show up on the online auction houses, and they can reach between $1,000 and $3,000, depending on their condition. The other end of the economic scale is this. This is a popcorn bucket. It was released at the parks a couple of years ago, and it's also accurate, incredibly accurate for a popcorn bucket. It's got headlamp, smokestack is correct, the domes are correct. The only thing that's not exactly right is that it has 2 air compressors on the sides instead of just 1, but a minor quibble. It also fits on G-scale track, So in theory, someone could run a popcorn bucket on their backyard railroad if they wanted to.
Finally, have you ever wanted to be a Disneyland Railroad engineer? Preston Niratisai, who drafted some of the great locomotive drawings you've seen in this episode, created a Disneyland Railroad sim. You can go through the same startup procedure and operations just like the engineer and fireman. Learn more at ckholidayplans.com. Remember, holiday is spelled with 2 L's. By the way, I'm not on commission. I just really like this sim.
In part 2 of this story, we'll cover all the changes to the Disneyland Railroad since 1957. More steam engines, more consists, more stations, more events, and more collectibles. Thanks to Michael Aronson, Steve DeGaetano, Preston Niratisai, and Tom Morris for their kind assistance with the research and images for this episode. Finally, I thank all of you for joining us on a grand half-circle tour on Once Upon a Train. Until next time, happy rails.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this grand circle tour on Once Upon a Train. For your convenience, the like and subscribe buttons will remain open for at least 1 additional hour. Thank you.